It is certainly true that more migration is going to add to housing demand because migrants need places to live just like everyone else. I think what's worth keeping in mind, though, is that the flow of migrants coming back into the country now is one not due to policy changes that the government has done. It's actually just the catch up of students and working holiday makers returning to Australia since COVID borders have been reopened.
Okay, so if it was migration that was going to happen anyway, but Australia still has the challenge of dealing with this and handling with this migration flow as we're going through a housing crisis. People who are renting are finding it really tough. How do you rate how the government is planning to manage this over the next 5 years?
Well, I think this is where the opposition does have a point. The government isn't doing enough at the moment to deal with the housing crisis. We're seeing rents rising at double-digit rates. Now, in the short term, the only way to really in the long term, the only way to deal with that is to build more housing. The government's plan for a housing accord to work with the states to build 1 million homes over the next 5 years. We were surprised that we didn't see more in the budget to actually push that through and try to get more home building happening now.
What more could the government have done on that front?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, the government should be basically working with the states, pushing the states to relax planning rules to allow more housing to be built in inner and middle ring suburbs of our major cities. The way to do that is to basically pay the states for reform. So if the states can guarantee or build more homes than otherwise would be the case, then we should be rewarding them because it involves the states taking what are otherwise potentially difficult choices to basically push through more density in inner and middle ring suburbs of our major cities. There are certainly residents in those communities that prefer that not to happen, but the reality is if Australia's population is growing, noting of course that the population will be smaller over the course of the next decade than it would have been in a pre-COVID world, then we need to build more housing. Otherwise, we have the kind of what we're seeing on the streets right now.
And what else could the government do on that front?
Well, certainly they could boost rent assistance further, which is really what they need to do in the short term. So the 15% increase in rent assistance is a start, but it's not going to take us that far. It's really going to deal with some of the rent increases that people have experienced just over the course of the last year itself. We've previously recommended an increase of at least 40%, which would put, about $1,500 a year into the pockets of low-income renters who are receiving income support. And it would help if the government's future fund legislation that's currently before the Senate, if that was also passed, because that would allow us to build more social and affordable homes, which is what we need to avoid homelessness at the bottom of the market.
So taking into account those ongoing challenges, are you comfortable that the government should accept 1.5 million extra migrants over the next 5 years, or should that number be curtailed so as to ease the pressure on the housing crisis?
So those 1.5 million more people that are going to come to Australia, it's worth noting that, this financial year, net overseas migration is supposed to be 400,000 people, the year that ends on 30 June. Now, most of those people are in fact already here. So when we talk about 1.5 million people, quite a lot of that number is actually already in the rearview mirror. The challenge we have is that, look, you could try to reduce parts of the migration intake if you wanted to, but the question then becomes, what parts do you want to reduce? We're seeing students come back to Australia that were previously here and are one of our largest exports. We could reduce that. It would have the effect of reducing revenues for our university and lowering the taxes that the federal government collects. We could reduce the number of working holiday makers in the country. That would, again, reduce pressures on population and therefore housing, but it would have the effect of meaning fewer people working in industries like hospitality and agriculture, which have seen really big skill shortages over the last few years. So there aren't easy choices here. If the government did make a call, or if a government wanted to make a call to reduce migration, they would have flow-on effects elsewhere, particularly for the federal budget. And I think that's the really difficult situation that we're in right now.
So you think with policy initiatives, migration as expected over the next several years is manageable?
Yes, I think so. The big change that's actually driven the stresses in our housing market is not so much migration, because it's actually just taking us back to the number of migrants we would have had if the pandemic hadn't occurred. What is instead driving is that Australians, in fact, demanding more housing than what they were before COVID because people are working from home, as I am today, or they've moved out of share houses, or they've moved out of the family home. And it's actually that demand for housing from Australians that is meaning that we're struggling to accommodate migrants that are returning to the country, given that those migration numbers that are returning now only take us back to roughly where we otherwise would have been if the pandemic had never happened.
And what about the problems that the federal government is having getting that legislation through federal parliament for social and affordable housing at the moment?
Look, we just want to see a deal get done. I think it's really important that we see that first 10 billion tranche of the Future Fund be delivered, because it will deliver the social homes that we need. It's certainly true that it's not enough, and so the Greens are rightly pointing out that they should go further. I think even Labor would acknowledge that $10 billion commitment, which was an election commitment, does not solve the problem. So ideally, we'd see some movement from both sides. Ideally, we'd see the size of that fund be raised to $20 billion, which is what Grattan originally recommended when we put it forward. But if we can't get that happening, then we at least hope that the legislation passes and we can get going on building those homes that are needed.